Nobody who worked inside the screens at Kure Naval Arsenal in 1939 was allowed to discuss what they were building. Not with family, not with neighbors, not with other workers in different sections of the same shipyard. The project had no public name. The dry dock had been excavated specifically for it, then roofed over with an enormous canopy of woven rope and timber so that nothing could be seen from above. Harbor records listed nothing. Budget documents visible to civilian officials contained nothing. When fishermen passing by the sealed-off section of the waterfront asked what was going on behind the screens, they were told the dock was being expanded for routine use. Technically, that was true. It was being expanded to contain something that had no name yet and no precedent in history. What was being built behind those screens would displace 72,000 tons when complete. It would carry 9 guns of a caliber never before mounted on any warship. Its armor belt would be thick enough that the engineers designing it calculated, with some confidence, that no shell currently in any foreign navy's inventory could penetrate it at combat ranges. It would be, by almost every measurable standard, the most powerful warship ever constructed by any nation at any point in history. And it would spend most of its operational life sitting at anchor. And when it finally sailed into battle, it would spend part of the engagement steaming in the wrong direction, and it would die without scoring a single confirmed hit on an enemy surface vessel. This is the story of how that happened. And the reason it happened is not stupidity, not incompetence, and not bad luck. It is something more interesting than any of those things. It is what occurs when a nation builds the perfect weapon for a war that ceases to exist before the weapon is finished. To understand it properly, you have to go back to 1921, to a conference room in Washington, D.C., and to a ratio that the Japanese naval establishment would spend the next 2 decades trying to make irrelevant. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was presented to the world as a breakthrough in international cooperation, a voluntary agreement among the great naval powers to cap the size of their fleets and prevent the kind of arms race that had helped drag Europe into the First World War. For the United States and Britain, it was a workable arrangement. For Japan, it was a number: 553. For every 5 tons of capital warship the Americans could build, and every 5 tons the British could build, Japan was allocated 3. The Japanese delegation in Washington signed the treaty. They had no serious alternative. Japan's industrial capacity could not sustain a direct building competition with the United States, and the people doing the negotiation understood that clearly. But there is a difference between signing a treaty and accepting the strategic reality it encodes. The naval officers who came home to Tokyo from Washington did not come home believing the matter was settled. They came home with a constraint and a problem, and they applied themselves to that problem with a systematic focus that the treaty's architects never fully anticipated. If quantity was capped, quality would have to compensate. Not slightly better ships, categorically, fundamentally superior ships. Vessels so far beyond anything the Americans could deploy in the Pacific that the numerical gap between the 2 fleets became strategically meaningless. The doctrine that crystallized around this thinking was called Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement. Japan would not attempt to control the entire Pacific. Japan would let the American fleet cross the ocean, patrol it along the way with submarines and massed destroyer torpedo attacks, and then destroy whatever arrived at the end of that transit with a concentrated line of capital ships so overwhelmingly powerful that the outcome of the engagement could not be in doubt. The Yamato and her sister Musashi were designed to be the core of that line. The ships around which the decisive engagement would be anchored. The design process began in earnest in 1934, when Japan formally walked away from the treaty system. Rear Admiral Keiji Fukuda led a team of naval architects through 4 years of calculations, scale models, and competing proposals before a final design was approved in March 1937. The constraints they were working within were genuinely difficult. The ship had to carry guns that outranged any American battleship.
It had to be armored against those same guns at the ranges where it would be expected to fight. It had to be fast enough to control the terms of an engagement. And it had to fit through the Shimonoseki Strait, the relatively narrow passage between Japan's inland sea and the open ocean, because a ship too wide to transit that strait cannot reach the Pacific and is therefore useless as a combat vessel regardless of how powerful it is. The width of a geographical feature determined the beam of the hull, and the beam of the hull shaped nearly every other dimension that followed. What the team finalized was unlike anything that had existed before. 9 46-centimeter guns in 3 triple turrets, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed 1,460 kilograms. Maximum range was just under 42 kilometers, a distance at which the curvature of the Earth is a real ballistic consideration. The turrets themselves weighed 2,700 tons each, heavier than many of the destroyers that would escort her. The main armor belt along the waterline was 410 millimeters thick, angled at 20 degrees to maximize resistance. Turret faces were 650 millimeters of hardened steel, effectively impervious to any existing gun at any range. Her anti-aircraft armament seemed reasonable in 1937 and would be progressively expanded as the war demonstrated how badly wrong that initial assessment was. By her final refit, she carried 162 anti-aircraft weapons of various calibers. It was still not enough, but that comes later. Construction proceeded under the same deliberate secrecy that had covered the dry dock from the beginning. Workers were compartmentalized by section so that no individual below the senior engineering level knew the complete picture. Hull dimensions, gun caliber, armor specifications, all of it classified. Japan understood that before the Yamato ever fired a round, her greatest strategic value was uncertainty. A foreign navy that does not know precisely what a ship can do cannot design tactics to defeat it with confidence. She was laid down in 1937 and commissioned on December 16, 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor. The timing of that commissioning date contains in compressed form the entire tragedy of what the Yamato was and what she was unable to become. On the morning of December 7th, Japanese aircraft had reached across the Pacific and destroyed or crippled 8 American battleships in a single strike. Kantai-Kessen doctrine assumed that American battleships would eventually sail west and meet Japanese battleships somewhere in the open Pacific. Pearl Harbor had just eliminated most of those battleships, but beyond the immediate damage it inflicted, Pearl Harbor demonstrated something that the architects of Kantai-Kessen had not built their doctrine around. It showed that aircraft launched from carriers could project decisive force at ranges that made the big gun battleship's entire operational concept look narrow. The Yamato's guns could reach 42 kilometers. American carrier aircraft were already striking at 10 times that distance. The ship designed to fight the decisive battle had been commissioned into a war where the decisive battles were being fought by a completely different category of weapon. She spent most of 1942 at anchor in the protected waters of the inland sea. Coral Sea, Midway, the prolonged and bloody struggle around Guadalcanal, none of these engagements involved her.
The carrier battles that were reshaping the Pacific War were fought at ranges where Yamato's guns were irrelevant, and her enormous fuel consumption made casual deployment difficult to justify when there were no suitable targets for her to engage. Among the sailors and officers who saw her riding at anchor month after month while the war happened elsewhere, she acquired a sardonic nickname, the Yamato Hotel. The name did not require much explanation. Before we get into what finally happened when she was committed to battle and why the engagement she was built for went so completely wrong, take a second and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. There is a lot more history like this here, and it helps more than you might think. Now, back to the story. The closest thing to a decisive surface engagement that the Yamato ever experienced came at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. the largest naval battle in recorded history by most measures. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining surface strength to stopping the American invasion of the Philippines. The operational plan required a powerful surface force centered on Yamato to transit the San Bernardino Strait, enter Leyte Gulf, and destroy the American transport and supply fleet sustaining the landings. Cutting that supply line would strand the invasion force ashore with no reinforcement and no resupply. On paper, it was the kind of high-stakes surface engagement Kon-Tai-Kessen had always envisioned. The force was attacked by American submarines before it even reached the Philippines, losing 2 heavy cruisers and having a third disabled. Crossing the Sibuyan Sea, it was subjected to 5 hours of sustained strikes by carrier aircraft, during which Musashi, the only ship in the world comparable to Yamato in size and power, absorbed approximately 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes before she capsized and went down. Yamato took 2 bomb hits, sustained some flooding, and remained combat effective. Then, the force commander, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, turned around and headed back west. American commanders watching from a distance concluded the threat had been broken. During the night, Kurita reversed course again. He drove the force back through the San Bernardino Strait, which was unguarded because the American surface group assigned to watch it had been successfully drawn away by a Japanese decoy operation involving the last of Japan's carrier hulls. At dawn on October 25th, the force emerged directly behind a small American escort carrier group, Taffy 3, a formation of light escort carriers and their destroyer screens that had no business being in a fight with battleships. It was, geometrically speaking, exactly the situation the Yamato had been designed and built for: heavy warships with a decisive gun advantage against outgunned, outranged enemy vessels with nowhere to run. What followed was not a massacre. The American escort carriers ran at maximum speed while their destroyers and destroyer escorts turned directly into the attacking Japanese fleet, charging at battleships and heavy cruisers with torpedoes and gunfire, making smoke, disrupting firing solutions, absorbing punishment to buy time. Pilots from the escort carriers flew strike after strike with empty ordnance racks, diving on Japanese ships without weapons simply to force them to maneuver and break their aim. Kurita, who had spent 2 days under continuous air attack and watched Musashi sink, became convinced through the confusion that he was facing a major fleet carrier group rather than escort carriers and small destroyers. He disengaged and withdrew. During the engagement, Yamato herself had been forced to turn away hard from an incoming torpedo spread and spent the better part of an hour steaming away from the battle before the threat cleared and she could reorient. By that point, Kurita had already made the decision to pull back. Her gunnery logs from the battle show no confirmed hits on any enemy vessel.